It's kind of wild, right? When we think of kids, childhoods, you picture carefree days, running around, no worries.
Yeah, the simple life.
Exactly. But when you actually start looking at the research, the reality for many kids is, well, it's pretty different.
Oh, absolutely. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, unfortunately.
I was looking at this study, it's a bit older now, from Sawhill and Chadwick, and it's startling, really. They found that preschoolers in central cities, they face almost double the risk factors compared to kids in the suburbs.
Wow, double. That is a huge difference.
It makes you stop and think, you know? What kind of pressures are these kids dealing with from such a young age? What are those forces that are shaping their lives? That's what we're diving into today.
It's such a crucial area to understand, especially if we're trying to get a handle on these bigger societal challenges. And what's really interesting is we're going to be looking at how things like art, music, drama, even just movement therapies are being used to support these kids. Kids growing up in these tough inner city environments.
Mhm. Right, and it's not just like a theoretical thing. We've got
Right.
research, yeah, but also case studies, descriptions of actual programs that are using these approaches, and insights into how it all works, the therapeutic side of it.
And what's really fascinating is we're seeing this play out in so many different places. I mean, we've got Chicago, New York, of course, those big cities, but also places like Alexandria, Virginia, and then even internationally, Kolkata, India. It's amazing to see how these approaches are being adapted.
So our mission today, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think, is to really pull out the core understanding. We want to figure out what are the specific stressors that impact these inner city kids.
Right. What are they facing day in and day out?
Exactly. And then how do those stressors actually show up? What are the emotional and behavioral outcomes?
Because those can be so varied, right?
They can. And then the big question, how can creative arts therapies actually step in? Can they make a difference? Can they act as interventions or even as protective factors? It's about peeling back the layers of this really complex issue and maybe finding some solutions, some truly innovative solutions.
I like that. Peeling back the layers. That's what we're doing today.
All right, so let's start with the basics. We keep saying at risk, but what does that actually mean? When we're talking about these kids, what are we talking about?
Well, we have to define our terms, right?
Mm.
So back in 98, McWhirter and his colleagues, they came up with a definition. They said at risk means being in danger of negative future events.
Negative future events. That's pretty broad.
It is, but they're talking about things like depression, struggling in school, maybe failing out, issues with substance use, not being able to hold down a job, and sadly, even things like ending up in prison or dying too young.
Okay, so pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, it's a pretty heavy list. And what's important to remember is it's often a whole bunch of different risk factors all mixed together, all playing a part in a kid's life.
And it's not just random chance whether a kid faces these risks, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about specific environments, specifically inner cities, where these risks seem to be way more concentrated. Why is that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no simple answer, but we can start by looking at the layers, like we talked about. So in these inner city environments, you often see a kind of perfect storm of stressors, societal stressors, environmental stressors, and then the stressors that are happening right within the family.
So multiple levels, all pushing down.
Exactly. And let's talk about basic resources first. Things like having enough nutritious food to eat, a safe place to live, consistent access to healthcare things many of us take for granted. In these inner city environments, those basic things are often really hard to come by.
So it's a lack of resources right from the start.
Right. But it goes beyond just the material stuff. There's also a lack of community resources. Think about things like good schools, safe places for kids to play, reliable public services. Those are often lacking too.
So it's not just about individual families struggling, it's the whole environment that's working against them.
Exactly. It's like the whole system is set up in a way that makes it harder to thrive. It's what Garbarino called, this is a great term, I think, socially toxic environments. And it's this combination of pervasive violence, deep poverty, ongoing exposure to trauma, high levels of depression in the community. And then on top of all that, a sense of alienation. Like you don't belong, you're on the outside.
It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does. And it really underscores why understanding those risk factors that you mentioned earlier is so important.
Okay, yeah, you were talking about some statistics that were pretty eye-opening. Can you remind me what those were?
Sure. So Sawhill and Chadwick, in their study, they looked at 4 major risk factors for preschoolers. Having a mom who wasn't married, a mom who was a teenager when she had the child, a mom without a high school diploma, and living in poverty. And get this, half of all the kids facing at least 3 of these risk factors lived in central cities.
Good math.
Half, compared to just 30% in the suburbs and 20% in rural areas. So overall, these kids in the city are facing these risks at twice the rate.
Twice the rate. And you mentioned something about kids born to unmarried mothers, too.
Right, that's just one example. In '96, the data showed 32% of kids in urban areas were born to unmarried moms. But in the suburbs, that number was only 17%. So again, a huge difference.
And I'm guessing it's not all kids in the city who are affected equally by these factors, right?
Sadly, no. It's the kids who are already the most vulnerable who are hit the hardest. The study found that the majority of these high-risk inner-city kids, well, they were from minority backgrounds. 50% African American, 34% other minorities, and only 16% white.
So there's a clear racial component here, too.
Absolutely. And then you layer on other environmental stressors. Census data from back in '95 showed that African American families in these cities, not only were their households larger on average, but they were also way more likely to be crowded,
Crowded.
meaning more than one person living in each room. Compared to white households, that kind of overcrowding can make life incredibly stressful. No space, no privacy, it all adds up.
It sounds like these communities are facing a lot of isolation, too.
They are. There's often a strong sense of community in these neighborhoods, people living close to family. Those cultural ties can be really powerful. But that can also lead to some isolation from the wider community. And then there's the issue of white flight.
White flight.
Yeah, when more affluent families move out to the suburbs, seeking better schools, safer neighborhoods, and that just drains even more resources from the city.
So it's a vicious cycle.
It is. And of course, education is a huge part of this. 2003 data from the Department of Education showed almost a quarter, 24% of school-age kids living in poverty were in central cities.
Those are the kids who are already starting school at a disadvantage.
Exactly. They might not have books at home. They might not be getting that early literacy support. And then the schools themselves often lack resources.
Right, those under-resourced urban schools. And how does this all tie into high school dropout rates? We hear a lot about that.
It's all connected. The kids who are most likely to drop out, they tend to come from poverty. They often have low academic skills. They've maybe had attendance problems, and their families might not have a history of higher education. And then the schools themselves, the ones with high dropout rates, well, they might have low expectations for their students, inconsistent discipline, a curriculum that just doesn't feel relevant. It's a recipe for disengagement and ultimately dropping out.
So we've got all these societal and environmental pressures, but then there's the family piece, too. And I imagine the challenges these families are facing are just as difficult, if not more so.
They are. And it's really important to remember these families are incredibly resilient. They're doing their best in incredibly difficult circumstances. But when you're constantly under stress, it takes a toll.
Of course.
So let's talk healthcare first. Kids in these inner city families, they often have higher rates of health problems, infant mortality, asthma, allergies, learning disabilities, and they tend to miss more school because of illness.
And why is that?
Well, one major factor is access to healthcare. Eberhard and his team, their research showed that about a third of low-income residents in central cities are uninsured. That means they're not getting regular checkups, they're not getting those early interventions that can make such a big difference.
Like everything just keeps stacking up against them.
It does. And then you add in the stress of unemployment. Imagine being a parent, trying to provide for your kids, and you just can't find a job. That level of stress has a huge impact on the whole family.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
McLeod and her team, back in '94, they found that when moms experience unemployment, it can actually lead to more depression and distress in the moms. And that often translates into more punitive parenting, less emotional availability for the kids. And the kids, in turn, can become more anxious, have lower self-esteem. It's heartbreaking.
It's a domino effect, isn't it? One stressor leads to another, and it ripples through the whole family.
Exactly. And then, within the home itself, the challenges can be just as difficult. We're talking about families who are facing poverty, often exposure to violence, just this constant sense of threat and instability. That makes it incredibly hard to be a consistent, supportive parent.
Right, the kind of parenting that kids need to thrive.
Exactly. And so you might see emotional unavailability, harsh discipline, lack of supervision, and all of that has real consequences for the kids.
What kind of consequences?
Well, Gorman Smith and his colleagues, they found that teenage boys in inner cities who committed violent crimes, they often reported having poor discipline at home, less family cohesion, less parental involvement. It's like that lack of support creates a breeding ground for these negative behaviors.
So a stable and supportive home life is crucial, but it's so hard to achieve when you're constantly facing these pressures.
It is. And research from Sagrestano and her team showed this really clearly. They found that more conflict in the home and less parental monitoring led to more depressive symptoms, not just in the kids, but also in the parents.
So it affects everyone.
It does. And then think about the pressure on kids when there's not enough parental supervision. Singer and his team found that lack of supervision was a big predictor of violent behavior in kids. Because it's not just about knowing where your kids are, it's about knowing who they're hanging out with, setting clear expectations, and following through with consequences.
It takes a lot of time and energy, and that can be hard to come by when you're just trying to survive.
Absolutely. And then, sadly, we have to talk about domestic conflict itself. When there's violence in the home directed at the mom, that's another layer of trauma for the kids.
It's devastating.
It is. Whether they see the violence directly or just hear it happening, it has a huge impact. And sometimes they get caught in the middle trying to protect a parent. That's a huge burden for a child.
So we've got this complex web of stressors, societal, environmental, familial. So no wonder these kids face so many challenges in their development. What are some of the specific outcomes, the things we actually see in these kids?
Well, you see it across the board, really. Emotionally, you see anxiety, depression. Cognitively, there might be learning difficulties, trouble concentrating. Behaviorally, you see what we call externalizing behaviors like aggression, acting out, maybe turning to drugs.
So acting out, lashing out.
Right. But you also see internalizing behaviors like withdrawal, becoming really quiet and withdrawn. And those can be signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. And given what we've talked about, PTSD makes sense.
Sadly, it does. And then socially, these kids might have trouble making friends. They might not have those social skills. And academically, they're at higher risk for falling behind in school, maybe even dropping out altogether.
It's like their whole world is being shaped by these experiences.
Yeah.
And even how they understand things like violence, that can be affected too, right?
Absolutely. Guerra and her colleagues did some really interesting research on this. They found that kids growing up in poverty, they're more likely to see violence as a normal, even necessary way to deal with conflict.
Like it's just a part of life.
Yeah, a part of life, a way to survive even. And that's a really scary thought because it becomes this cycle that's hard to break.
Right. It gets normalized. And you mentioned PTSD earlier. Given the high rates of violence these kids are exposed to, that seems like a really serious concern.
It is. PTSD, it can happen after someone experiences or witnesses something truly horrific. And these kids are seeing things that no child should ever have to see.
What are some of the signs of PTSD in kids?
Well, they might have flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts about the trauma. They might avoid anything that reminds them of what happened. Or they might just shut down emotionally, become numb.
Like they're trying to protect themselves.
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of problems, trouble concentrating, acting out, even losing skills they already had. They might feel hopeless about the future, start to withdraw from people.
It's like they lose their spark.
It can feel that way. And it's important to remember there's no one-size-fits-all picture of PTSD. Some kids might become really clingy, afraid to be alone. Others might have changes in their personality, become more aggressive, more irritable.
So it can manifest in different ways.
It can. And research from Burton and Stab, also Warner and Weist, they found that PTSD rates are alarmingly high in inner-city kids because they're constantly being exposed to violence in their neighborhoods, sometimes even in their schools.
It's like the trauma just keeps piling on.
Yeah.
And I imagine things like a child's gender, their support system, their coping mechanisms, those all play a role too, right?
Yeah, they do. Some kids are more resilient than others, but everyone has their breaking point.
So given all these challenges, all this trauma, where do creative arts therapies fit in? What can they actually do for these kids?
That's where things start to get hopeful. Because amidst all the risk factors, there are also what we call protective factors, things that can actually buffer the impact of trauma.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. And creative arts therapies, they can tap into these protective factors, things like social support, access to mental health professionals, even having strong religious beliefs. These are all things that can help kids cope better.
So it's about building resilience.
Exactly. And the main goal of therapy when you're working with these kids is to help them process those traumatic experiences, to make sense of them in a healthy way, and to give them coping strategies for dealing with all the stress.
So it's not just about talking about their feelings. It's about giving them tools to deal with those feelings.
Right. And it's important to remember there's no one magic solution. It often takes a combination of different interventions working together.
Like a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
So what are some of the common goals that these different creative arts therapies have?
Well, a lot of them focus on encouraging emotional expression because these kids, they might not have the words to express what they're going through, or they might be afraid to talk about it, so it all gets bottled up inside.
So art gives them a different way to express themselves.
Exactly. And then another goal is normalizing their reactions. It's about helping them understand that their feelings are valid, their normal reactions to what they've been through is not their fault.
Right. It's about validation.
It is. And then there's also a focus on challenging negative thought patterns. Those I'm bad, it's all my fault kind of thoughts that can really take hold after trauma.
So helping them to see things differently.
Exactly. And a lot of these therapies, they also really emphasize building social support, helping kids connect with their peers, with trusted adults, creating that sense of belonging.
Right. That sense of community.
Exactly. And then, of course, the whole therapeutic environment itself needs to feel safe. It needs to be a place where kids feel comfortable opening up, taking risks.
Like a haven. And you mentioned earlier that the therapist's role might change depending on the kind of trauma a child has experienced.
Right. So Garbarino, he talked about this. He said if a kid has been through a single really intense traumatic event, like a car accident or witnessing a shooting, the therapist's focus might be on helping them regain a sense of safety, get back to some kind of normalcy.
Like putting the pieces back together.
Exactly. But if the trauma is ongoing, if it's chronic, like living in a violent neighborhood or experiencing abuse at home, then the therapist might need to address those deeper patterns of fear, those ingrained survival mechanisms.
It's a different kind of work.
It is. And we shouldn't forget about schools either. They play such a huge role in these kids' lives.
And they're there every day. So how can schools help?
Well, there's this growing focus on what's called social and emotional learning, or SEL. It's about intentionally teaching kids those social and emotional skills they need to thrive. Things like self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, relationship skills.
So not just academics, but also life skills.
Exactly. And research from Cohen, Zins, and others has shown that when schools do this well, when they really prioritize SEL, it actually helps kids do better academically too.
Interesting. So it's all connected. Now, you talked earlier about some of the deeper therapeutic concepts behind creative arts therapies, things like transference and countertransference.
Yeah.
Can you explain those a little more?
Sure. So transference, this is a big one in therapy in general. Basically, it means that a client might unconsciously start treating the therapist the way they treated someone important in their past.
Okay, so like projecting those past relationships onto the therapist.
Exactly. So imagine a kid who had a really critical parent always putting them down. They might come into therapy expecting the therapist to be critical too, even if the therapist is nothing like that. That's transference.
So it's like they're bringing their baggage into the therapy room.
They are. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. If the therapist can recognize what's happening, they can actually use it to help the kid work through those old patterns.
So it's about understanding where those feelings are coming from. What about countertransference?
So countertransference is kind of the flip side. It's about the therapist's own feelings and reactions to the client.
So like if the therapist has their own baggage.
In a way, yes. And this is where self-awareness is so important for therapists, because if they're not careful, their own unresolved issues could get in the way of helping the client.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a therapist who had a really difficult relationship with their sibling. They might unconsciously react more harshly to a client who reminds them of that sibling, even if the client's behavior isn't that bad objectively.
So it's about being aware of those biases, those triggers.
Exactly. Good therapists are always reflecting on their own stuff, making sure it's not interfering with their work.
And the relationship between the therapist and the kid seems especially important in these creative approaches.
Right. It's at the heart of it, really. Bannister, he suggested that doing these creative activities together, it can actually mirror the way a child interacts with a caregiver early on, like playing together, creating something together.
So it creates a familiar dynamic.
It does. And for some kids, especially those who've had positive relationships with adults in their lives, that can make therapy feel less scary, more approachable.
Right, like a safe space to explore.
And even for kids who haven't had those positive experiences, the therapy relationship itself can be a chance to heal, to build that trust they might be missing.
It's powerful stuff. And I think it's important to point out It's not just about the end product, is it? It's about the process of creating, too.
You got it. That's one of the things that makes creative arts therapy so unique. The act of creating, whether it's music, art, drama, movement, that in itself can be therapeutic.
So it's about the journey, not just the destination.
I like that. And then there's the tangible product, too. That drawing, that song, that dance, it can become something the kid can hold on to, something they can reflect on.
A symbol of their growth.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Winnicott's idea of transitional objects earlier. How does that relate to this?
So transitional objects, those are things like a favorite blanket or a teddy bear that a kid gets really attached to.
Like a security blanket.
Exactly. And in therapy, the art materials, the instruments, the props, they can kind of become transitional objects too. They represent something safe, something comforting, and they give the kid a way to express those really big, scary feelings without feeling overwhelmed.
So it's about creating distance, a sense of safety.
Right? And it can also help the therapist and the kid connect. They can talk about the art, the music, the play, and that can open up deeper conversations.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics. Let's talk about how these different creative arts therapies actually work in practice. Let's start with music therapy. What are some of the key techniques?
Well, one really powerful technique is songwriting. Cordobies, Dalton, and Kraut, they've all done research showing how helpful this can be for kids. It lets them express those big feelings, it helps them make sense of their experiences, and it can even teach them social skills if they're writing songs
I
together.
like that collaboration piece. And you had that great example of Harry and his rap.
Oh yeah, Harry. He was writing about the violence he was seeing in his neighborhood, how much he wanted things to be peaceful, but when he was just reading the lyrics, he was kind of flat, detached.
Like he wasn't really connecting with it.
Yeah. But then the therapist suggested he try rapping them. And wow, what a difference. He came alive. He put so much energy and emotion into it.
So the music helped him connect with those feelings.
It did. And from that point on, he was way more engaged in the therapy. It was like the music unlocked something in him.
Amazing. And it's not just about processing negative stuff. It can also be about working through difficult life experiences, right? Like with Daryl's rap.
Exactly. Daryl's rap was so powerful. He was talking about being in foster care, feeling alone, even though he was surrounded by people. And the rap, it gave him a way to express all that pain, all that loneliness that he might not have been able to put into words otherwise.
So the music gave him a voice. And it sounds like sometimes the biggest challenge is just getting those teenagers to participate in the first place, like in the Turtle Bay Music School program.
Oh, yeah, they definitely had some resistance at first. Some of the girls were angry. They felt like they were being forced to be there. It took a lot of patience from the therapist to build trust, to find ways to connect with them on their level.
It's about meeting them where they're at.
Exactly. And one thing that really helped was actually talking about the music they were listening to outside of therapy, even the music with violent lyrics. It was a way to open up a dialogue to explore those difficult themes.
So using their own culture as a bridge.
Exactly. And you had that other example, Shanice, and her journey of integrating different parts of herself through music.
Oh yeah, Shanice. She was so quiet and withdrawn at first.
She was, but then she started sharing her musical tastes. And it was interesting because she loved this really soft, emotional music, which was so different from the tough image she projected.
So there was this hidden side to her.
There was, and the therapist, by accepting that side of her, by appreciating it, it helped Shanice start to accept it too, and eventually she even found ways to bring together her love of rap and her love of classical music. It was like she was integrating those different parts of herself.
Symbolically, through music.
Exactly. And the creation of that community room at Turtle Bay, that was a turning point too.
A community room, right?
It gave the kids a place to hang out before and after their sessions, to connect with each other informally, and that really strengthened the sense of community, made the therapy even more effective.
So it was about creating a space where they felt like they belonged.
Exactly, and it actually led them to develop this three-tiered approach to music therapy: individual sessions, group work, and then these community-based music activities.
So a holistic approach, encompassing different levels.
Exactly. And you mentioned that example of Bill and how they combined analytical music therapy with play therapy.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
It was a really clever integration of two approaches. So AMT, it focuses a lot on talking about the music, analyzing the symbolism. Play therapy, on the other hand, it's all about using play to communicate,
So words versus play.
In a way, yeah. But with Bill, they used both. So they would analyze his music, talk about the recurring themes, like the monsters that kept showing up, which probably represented his fears and
Right,
anxieties.
those symbolic representations.
And then they would use play therapy techniques, like
Mhm.
letting him throw splat eggs to get out his anger, or using a dollhouse to work through his grief. It was all about finding the right tools for him.
Tailoring the approach. And there was that other example, operatic play, which seems so powerful for those little kids who were living in such chaos.
It was amazing. I mean, these were young kids who had been through so much, their lives were so unstable, but the music, it created this sense of safety, this holding environment, as Winnicott called it. It allowed them to let go, to express those big emotions through play and music.
It's like the music was holding them together.
It really was. And Lisa, with her sad story, she was a great example of that. The music gave her a container for her feelings as she was acting out different scenes, playing different roles. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to art therapy. You mentioned the mural project in Bedford-Stuyvesant after the shooting of Timothy.
Yeah, that was such a powerful example of how art can help a community heal after a tragedy. Timothy's death, it was so senseless, it caused so much pain. And the mural, it gave the high school students a way to express their grief, their anger, their love for Timothy.
So it was a collective grieving process.
It was. And the art therapist, she was amazing. She created this safe space where they could let all those feelings out. And the mural itself, it became a symbol of their shared experience, their resilience.
It's like the art gave them a tangible way to process the loss.
Exactly. And Kathy Moon, she's an art therapist, she talks about how the artwork itself can be a bridge to deeper conversations. Because it's concrete, it's there in front of you, it's easier to talk about a drawing than it is to talk about those abstract, messy feelings sometimes.
Right. It gives you something to focus on.
It does. And the C4 ABLA program in Chicago, they did some really interesting work with art therapy, too.
Remind me about that one.
They used art as a way to engage families who might not have been open to traditional therapy. So they had these after-school art programs for kids, which were really appealing. And through that, they were able to build relationships with the families, identify kids who needed more help, and just create this supportive environment where everyone could learn some coping skills.
There's like a gateway to therapy.
It was. And their Create Community project, that was amazing too. They used art to empower kids living in neighborhoods that were undergoing big changes, like urban renewal. It gave them a voice, a way to express their hopes and fears about what was happening.
So art as a tool for social change, too.
Exactly. And then there's the SOHO program in Alexandria, which focuses on at-risk girls.
Soho, right. Tell me about that one.
It stands for Space of Her Own. And it's this amazing mentoring program where they pair middle school girls with adult women. And they do all these art activities along with life skills development.
So it's about creativity and empowerment.
It is. And at the end of the program, they get to remodel their bedrooms. It's like a trading spaces makeover, but with this deeper therapeutic purpose.
Wow, that's awesome.
It is. And the girls, they get so much out of it. They build their confidence. They learn to express themselves. And the remodeled room, it becomes this symbol of their worth, their potential.
It's like a physical manifestation of their growth.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that the program often has a ripple effect on the whole family. Some of the moms were so inspired by what their daughters were going through that they started seeking help for themselves too.
That's amazing. And the Focus program, which used photography, that seemed like a really effective way to connect kids to their community.
It was. They learned all about photography, even the old school darkroom techniques. And it wasn't just about taking pretty pictures. Their photos were used in community art projects, exhibitions. So they were using their art to make a difference, to raise awareness about issues like nonviolence.
So art as activism.
Exactly. And then in individual art therapy, there are specific techniques that can be really helpful, like the kinetic house tree person drawing, where the kid draws a house, a tree, a person, but they have to be doing something in action.
What does that tell you?
Well, it can reveal a lot about their inner world, their relationships, and then there's collage, where they use images and words from magazines and stuff.
So it's about piecing together their story, their identity.
It is. And these techniques, they can be less threatening for kids who are struggling to talk about their feelings. It's a way to approach those difficult emotions indirectly.
Okay, let's talk about drama therapy now. You mentioned using pretend telephones in school suspension programs. That sounds interesting.
It is. It's all about giving those kids a safe way to explore the issues that might have led to their suspension. Like maybe they were pressured into doing something they didn't want to do, or maybe they're having problems at home. The pretend phone calls, the role playing, it creates distance, makes it feel less personal.
Right, so they can try out different scenarios, different ways of responding.
Exactly. And one thing they did in those groups that was really cool is they had the kids act out a vision of peace. Like, what would a peaceful world look like to them? It was a powerful way to end the sessions, to leave them on a hopeful note.
So even amidst all the conflict, there's still hope.
Always. And drama therapy is great for teaching kids about emotions, too. There's this stoplight model they use where red is for those big, overwhelming feelings, yellow is for slowing down.